Hello everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and finally we're going to get back on the bandwagon here with our series on the quick Ruy Lopez. This is now part 5 on the part 5 on the Ruy Lopez. The particular topic is the Berlin, and we'll be examining sidelines. So everything before we get to the famous wall variation. So the wall begins at this point. And so we'll discuss everything in the Berlin that, well, not everything, but we'll cover all of the main sidelines, I hope, between the place where the Berlin defense begins officially, which is with the move 3 knight f6 in response to the Ruy Lopez, all the way up through the beginning of the wall. All right, now we'll see if we get through it all or not. But let's go ahead and get started here. So first of all, before we get to castling on move 4 here, white has at least 5 other alternatives. So I'll hit them in, I think, reverse order. So one is to play bishop takes c6, and this is just a slightly less promising version of the exchange variation from white's point of view. So I think white is better served to avoid this. I actually faced this once and won the game, but not because of the variation. So I think first I was maybe a tiny bit better, and then maybe my opponent was a tiny bit better, and then I came up with, well, actually I'm not even sure if it was better at all, but maybe very, very slightly. Anyway, I came up with a neat little tactical trick, and he fell into it, and I won. But, I mean, more or less the game revolved around equality for quite a while. He was a good player. He was an FM who's since become an IM. Okay, next line is knight c3, and I don't want to say too much about this, basically because we've transposed into another opening. This is now the 4 knights, Spanish 4 knights. Well, I guess if you call it a Spanish 4 knights, maybe there's an obligation to say more about it, but I'm not going to, because it's generally a 4 knights, and Spanish is modifying it rather than taking over the nomenclature. Here, black has lots and lots of choices. He could play d6, and then we are in a Spanish. We are in a Ruy Lopez. This is just this is a Steinitz variation by transposition. Historically, the main move was bishop to b4, going into the symmetrical line, and I think black is doing just fine here, but there's plenty of theory to be discussed. There's also bishop to c5, which is okay, but maybe white has some chances for an edge in this position. Among the promising moves here are castles d3 and knight takes e5. There's knight to d4, which is Rubinstein's variation, and this is a very good line for black, but it's also very tricky, very theoretical, and if you're not going to see this variation very often, there's not really a lot of reason to discuss it. Finally, I'll mention, I think, the move that's my own preference at this point, and that's bishop to d6. And part of the fun is that it just looks so darn ugly. But really, it's a very logical move. The bishop's not going to stay on d6. Rather, black's idea is to just give kind of a stopgap measure to protect the pawn on e5, and later on the bishop will move someplace else, either to c5 or maybe back to e7, sometimes back to f8, after, for instance, black castles and plays rook to e8. Sometimes the knight will hop from c6 over to g6, and it seems that black is doing just fine here. Score in the databases is in fact positive. So I think this is a reasonable way to go here, but again, you're not going to see this very often if you play the Berlin. So you should know about it, but not worry about it. Of course, you might see it through 4 knights as well. All right, so that's all I want to say about knight to c3, and it's not a lot. If we say a lot about that, we'll never finish with this series. For all I know, we won't anyway, but we'll try, and we'll have a better chance if we at least don't get too bogged down on sidelines. Okay, well now there are 3 other sidelines that I want to discuss in a bit more depth. There's d3, there's queen to e2, and there's d4. Okay, and we'll start with d4, which is a kind of a lively move. And you might also see it through a Scotch move order too. So you might here see d4, e takes d4, and then bishop to b5. So it's worth being aware of it from that order as well. Okay, here I would say to play e takes d4, and now white has 2 choices. You can either castle or play e5. We'll start with e5. on this. Knight to e4, castles, and here black has, I think, two perfectly reasonable ways to continue. Bishop to e7 should be just fine. Knight takes d4. Now we're not going to greedily take the pawn on e5. I'm not sure if it can be done or not, but we won't find out if it can. We'll just castle. And after knight f5, d5. And whether white takes on c6 first and only then takes on e7, or whether he takes on e7 straight away and we recapture with the knight, in either case, black is just equal. This promises, I think, white little to nothing. All right, but we can also, instead of playing bishop to e7, play a6, which is kind of funny, offering a chance to go into a regular open Ruy Lopez here. So bishop to a4, for instance. Okay, actually, maybe you can just play, at this point, b5. Let me think about this. So b5, bishop to b3, d5. Yeah, I don't know if this will actually get into a regular open Ruy or not, because if e takes d6. So I retract this comment, and I'll stick with the main suggestion here, which is bishop to e7. All right, now from here, white has two options, rook to e1 and knight takes d4. If rook e1, simply knight c5, and whenever white plays bishop takes c6 in these positions, you play d takes c6. And really white shouldn't have anything here. Okay, alternatively, knight takes d4. And now we just castle, and this is pretty similar to what we already saw. Knight f5. Yeah, it's not exactly identical because we don't have a6 and bishop to a4 thrown in, but it's extremely similar. d5. All right, if bishop takes c6, bc, knight e7, queen e7, rook e1, rook e8, for instance. And here, if f3, it's good to realize that you have this little tricky, well, it's not tricky, but it's just it's tactically astute, the retreat to d6. You can't take because the rook on e1 is underprotected, and I think black is even a little bit better here. So it's better for white to just take on e7. You should recapture with the knight, since queen takes would hang the d5 pawn. And I think this is just equal. It really doesn't seem that white has anything here, either visually or in terms of the engine, and certainly not in terms of practice. Black has a big plus score here. Okay, probably that big plus score is because lower rated players with white were groveling for a draw and hoping that something this boring or this out of the way would do the job, but it's really nothing good for white. Okay, so going back, we've seen that e5 really doesn't promise white anything after knight e4, castles, and either the immediate bishop to e7 or a6 first and then bishop to e7. So the better move, or at least the more interesting move, is castles kingside here. And now black should play a6 once again. All right, again, going for some kind of delayed exchange variation just gives white nothing at all. This is a better version for black. And here black is equal. He has no problems whatsoever. Bishop pair is good. He'll finish his development without any difficulties. No problems at all. Bishop to a4 is a better try. And now after bishop to e7, white can again choose. If he plays e5, this just turns into what we already saw. After knight to e4, we're back to the positions we already looked at. Rook to e1 is independent. Okay, now b5, and now d6. All right, of course, white should not play knight takes d4. This is just the hoary old Noah's Ark trap. So if you haven't seen this before, it's important to know it. And it's not just this exact position. So the Noah's Ark trap refers to this trick in the Ruy Lopez where black gets to play c5, c4, and says bon voyage to the hapless bishop on b3. So if it's not winning for black, it's close enough. Here, therefore, white plays bishop to d5. Now we take, play knight to e5, and after knight takes d4 and black castles, white really has no advantage to speak of here at all. In fact, just no advantage, period. Note, by the way, that f4, which looks pretty good, because if the knight moves, you play knight to c6, and it looks like it's going to be good times. Well, unfortunately, for white anyway, there's bishop to g4. Okay, queen to d2 is forced, and now we play knight to c4 with tempo. All right, let's say queen to d3, and black has plenty of good moves here. You can play whatever, rook to e8, bishop to f6, bishop to h4 is the most common move, although maybe after rook to f1, all right, I'm not sure if it's better or not to force the rook out of the way. But anyway, black is fine here, and black is fine after bishop to f6. All right, the knight going to c6 is just not the end of the world at all. Okay, so black is just fine in all of these cases, and here he's equal at least. f4, maybe, I don't know if it's even worse for white, but just pointing out that dangerous-looking possibility isn't in fact dangerous. All right, so that takes care of the move 4d4. So now we've knocked out bishop takes c6, we've knocked out knight to c3, and we've knocked out d4. So that leaves queen to e2 and d3, besides the main move, of course. Okay, so queen to e2, and now black doesn't need to play bishop to c5, but it's not bad. It can also play a6. So a6 is fine. Because on bishop c6, dc6, knight e5, we have queen d4, and we regain the pawn. So that's also entirely possible. And probably you can play d6 as well. I mean, I can't imagine that this could be too bad either, but let's just play bishop to c5. All right, now here there's a choice. White can play, well, can obviously take the knight if he wants, and then take the pawn on e5. That would be at least what passes for a principal try. Or he could play c3 and try to build up in the center. Okay, let's start with bishop takes c6. So here, for once, we do play b takes c6. Okay, now knight takes e5, and here I think black has two perfectly legitimate, fully equalizing possibilities: castling and queen to e7. Okay, so let's say castles, threatening rook to e8, d3. Rook e8 anyway, and now if the knight retreats, we can play d5. So f4, and now bishop to a6. And now there are tricks with d6 and then taking on e4, taking advantage of the pin on the diagonal. Black, as I said, is I think already a little bit better here. And just to illustrate how it can go from being a little better to a lot better, let's suppose white plays the very natural move knight to c3, giving the e4 pawn more protection. Well, d6. Now, if the knight retreats, then probably knight takes e4 followed by d5 should be entirely good. But let's say white really goes for the full course dinner here. Queen d7, b4, bishop to b6, and knight a5. All right, white's up 2 pawns. The e4 pawn seems at least to be kind of defended for the moment, but black's initiative is going to just take over completely. Bishop to d4. Now, the threat is to take and then to play rook takes e4. So white needs to play queen to d2 to get his queen off of the e-file. Well, now queen to g4. And now the threat is to play, well, there's a few threats actually. One threat is to play bishop takes c3 and then take on e4 with whatever black wants to, because d takes e4 will allow queen to e2 mate. So let me just illustrate. Okay, so if the queen's here, and we take either way, let's say with the rook, pawn takes, queen e2 is mate, it's defended by the bishop, the knight on c3 is gone, we've exchanged it, and the queen is on c3. Okay, so there was a game, Sawatsky against Meyer, played in Germany in 2003, and by some miracle or complete failure on black's part, white survived. But for the moment, black's play was perfect. b5, bishop takes c3, queen g2, rook f1, takes, and here I think black took on e4 with the rook. White played bishop to e3, and he was still worse, but it wasn't quite as catastrophically bad as it would be with just bishop takes b5. Threatening mate, threatening queen f1, and rook f2 doesn't help because of queen to g1 check. So knight c4 is about the only thing that white can do here. Then takes, rook e4, and white is toast. Okay, if he plays king to d1 or d2, queen d4 check wins the rook on a1. So king f2, queen c2 check, rook e8, and black has a queen and 3 pawns for a rook and a bishop, which is already a huge material advantage, and rook e2 is coming, so that's going to make it even worse. This is just 100% lost for white. All right, so we can see that after knight takes e5, castles gives black very good play, and he can even play queen e7. This is fine too. f4, d6, knight c6, queen e4. This is probably okay as well, but let's just stick to castling. This is perfectly clean, and while queen e7 should be okay, yeah, so we can have something like this, and probably black is in okay shape, but yeah, let me just get rid of this line because I think castling is so much simpler. All right, so that's that. Bishop takes c6 is not a worry. c3, okay, this is a more interesting move. Now castles, and here black can try several moves. Rook to e8 is perfectly fine. d5 is perfectly fine. And he can even play d6 with the idea that, okay, bishop takes c6, bc, d4, and it looks as if white has grounds for being happy, because if the bishop retreats, we can maybe take on e5, maybe twice. And on takes, it looks like white has gotten what he loves in the Ruy Lopez. He's got his nice ideal pawn center. The knight's going to come to c3. Maybe he can play bishop to g5. And life is good, and flowers are blooming, and birds are singing, and all of that. But in fact, it's not quite so simple. Bishop to b6, knight c3, rook e8. And black has some pressure against the white center. Knight takes e4 is a possibility, for instance. Black has the bishop here. And let's say white plays bishop to g5. Well, now black is going to be better. h6. If white plays bishop takes f6, then black is going to be very happy with the two bishops against two knights. And on bishop to h4, though, g5 is entirely good. Bishop g3, g4, and black can perfectly safely take on d4 next move. So this is clearly better. So I think that this position after rook to e8 is probably about equal, where white has the center, yes, but and a better pawn structure thanks to the black doubled pawns on the c-file, but the black bishop pair and central and pressure against white center count. Okay, so that's all I need to say, I think, about queen to e2. Finally, before we get to castles, there's also d3. And here, black can again play more than one move. He could play d6, which goes into a Steinitz variation, but one that's a tempo up, because white's played d2, d3, and I think this extra tempo may well be enough to give black equality. But bishop to c5 is the more ambitious move, and it's certainly not bad. And here white can play various moves. He could castle, he could play knight to c3, he could take on c6, but probably the most natural move is c3. And it's the most flexible move as well. Okay, black can just castle, and now we'll talk about two moves for white. He can play bishop to g5, or he can castle. And let's start with bishop to g5, which certainly looks very aggressive. Okay, d6, knight b to d2, bishop to b6, knight c4. And here, I think black has at least three legitimate ways to proceed, although two are very similar. One is to play knight to b8. And the idea will be to play c6, and then knight b to d7. And in that way, the pin is not going to be serious. Or bishop to e6 maybe first, and then knight b to d7. But black could also play the immediate knight to e7, not fearing bishop takes f6. The knight will go to g6, it'll be quite good. And, well, black has the bishop here. Of course, white can play knight takes b6, but then that knight isn't going to be able to help swing over to the king side. So anyway, I think black is fine there. Or he could also play h6 first, and only then knight to e7. So you can decide whether you like the pawn on h6 or not in case of white playing bishop takes f6. The plus side of throwing it in is that if white doesn't take, then knight to g6 comes next move, and will force either the bishop back to the poor g3 square, or simply get it exchanged off. Okay, so bishop to g5 looks very aggressive, looks very appealing, but I think black can neutralize it without too much difficulty. So next up is castles, and here black should just continue developing normally. d6, bishop to b6, bishop a4, knight e7, bishop c2, c6, h3, knight to g6. And black is just making normal Ruy Lopez moves. And then here, after, well, okay, d5 was played in a Radjabov-Kramnik game from their recent candidates match. Black is equal here and went on to win. I think it was a blitz game. But black could also play bishop to e6. This should be completely fine. Even knight h5 is fine. Knight takes e5 is not a big deal because you can play d takes e5 and then e takes d4. So no big deal with that. All right, so all of this is equal. And yeah, and so that finishes up with d3. Okay, so in sum then, the sidelines, I mean, you should know a little bit about them. Some of them are a little bit trickier than others. And none of them, except for bishop takes c6, I think, is without its little drop of poison. But I don't think any of them promises an advantage either against a reasonably well-prepared opponent with black. So castles is the most important move, definitely. All right, well here, black, of course, is going to play knight takes e4. That's our main line. But there's also bishop to c5. Fortunately, though, we don't have to say anything about it because we already covered it on the move order 3 bishop to c5 castles, knight f6. So if you're curious about that, take a look at that older show. No reason why we should repeat it here. So on to knight takes e4. And now white has definitely got some important alternatives. Okay, in addition to d4, which is our main move, there's rook to e1, and there's queen to e2. And both of these moves have a bit of bite. So in fact, I'm going to come back to that. So I'll come back to that in part 2 of our Berlin sideline presentation. And first we'll look at d4, and we'll look at the other sidelines here. So I think these can be dealt with more cleanly, and they're more sideline-ish than the rook e1 and queen e2 lines. In other words, the things that we're going to look at here that are sidelines are less common than the sidelines we're going to look at next time. Okay, so let's start with what white can play. Sorry, with what black will play at this point. Okay, knight to d6 is our main move, but let's start with a6. And this is kind of interesting. I have a friend who likes this as a way of trying to get to the open Ruy without having to worry about the exchange variation. Of course, white could play, well, okay, that's what you get with bishop a4, d5. So now after d takes e6, bishop e6, we're in a regular open Ruy Lopez. The problem with this, or at least let's see, the dangerous part is bishop takes c6. So dc, queen e2, bishop to f5, and this is kind of an interesting sideline. So when my friend first showed me this, I thought, well, what about g4? This looks kind of interesting, but I was able to work this out to being okay for black. So the main line is bishop to g6, knight e5, and here black needs to be bold and play queen takes d4. But if he does it, he's okay. So knight takes, pawn takes, and the problem here is that if you play something like, well, f3 is illegal. If you try to prepare it with something like bishop to e3, then black can play queen to e5, threatening mate on h2. And in all these lines, he seems to be perfectly okay. The damage to the white king side is more worrisome for white than the pinned knight on e4 should be for black. So white probably has nothing better than knight to c3. And now black has to play f5, but it's good enough. And he's got a castle queen side, so all of this damage on the king side is really not very serious. It's much more worrisome for white, as I said. So bishop to f4 is probably best, covering that diagonal. Black castles, rook a to d1, queen f6, and white can regain the pawn, but after all of the captures are over, it really seems that black is just fine. So on the one hand, you might think that white has something because his majority on the king side is clean, even if the king side setup is a bit gappy. But in fact, the black doubled pawns, being where they are, makes it much more difficult, much more unpleasant of a task for white to create a passed pawn. And so I think on balance, this position is about equal. So g4 is not fatal, tricky though it is, but white should play rook to e1. And this occurred in a game between Ivanchuk and Carlsen in the Morelia or Linares tournament. Well, Morelia/Linares. I don't remember which of the two cities this particular game was played in. But while Carlsen won with black in that game, he was in big trouble. And there are simple improvements for Ivanchuk. Okay, in that game, Carlsen played bishop to b4, though it might be better to play bishop to d6 or bishop to e7, although I think in both cases white maybe keeps a pull. Bishop to e7 is not as good as bishop to d6, and the reason is that now g4 is a bit more effective. And here, bishop to e7, the interpolation of bishop to e7 and rook to e1, of course, favors white. So white has maybe not a winning advantage, but a pleasant advantage. So the best move, though, is bishop to d6. And now white can win some material with queen to d3. Castles, rook e4, takes, let's say rook e8, and something like the following is possible. And here I think white is maybe a touch better. I mean, in general, the minor pieces are going to be more useful than the rook and the pawn, unless the rooks are really active or the pawn majority is meaningful. And here, because of the doubled c-pawns, the pawn majority is not terribly meaningful. The black rooks are certainly okay, but they're not really achieving that much. So I think probably white is a little bit better here. But it's playable for black. Okay, Carlsen shows bishop to b4 to take away the c3 square from a white knight. But c3 is not that useless. And in fact, after bishop to d6, instead of queen to d3, queen to c2 might have been even a little bit better for white. Okay, Carlsen played queen to d7. And now d takes e5, bishop c5, rook e4. And here Carlsen was in huge trouble. I mean, he just, Ivanchuk had eaten up a lot of time on the clock to get here, and Carlsen managed to bamboozle his opponent, but this position itself is not good for black. Okay, castles, knight b to d2, queen d5, king h, f1, rook h to e8. And here, for instance, c4 followed by knight to b3, as suggested by Marin and probably also the computers, is at least clearly better for white, and maybe even just winning. So black is in bad shape here. Okay, if you got Carlsen on your side, maybe you'll pull it out, but you don't want this position. All right, so the bottom line is that this a6 approach may not be so fantastic. I mean, maybe it's not the end of the world after rook e1 if black plays bishop to d6. But I still wouldn't recommend it either. I think white has a genuine pull. Okay, so that's a6. There's also e takes d4, the so-called Riga variation, and this is it's briefly very exciting, and then you reach a complicated ending where white should be a little bit better. So the way it goes is this: rook to e1, d5, knight takes d4, and now bishop to d6. So this looks very tricky. But again, there's a very forcing variation, the result of which is that white is better. Knight takes c6, bishop h2 check. And now, of course, not king takes h2, when queen h4, queen f2 gives black a perpetual. Maybe you can even look for more, but I think it's just a perpet. But okay, king to h1 is the right move, queen h4, and then this little tactical trick, rook takes e4. Okay, if queen e4, then the bishop's going to hang. And on de, then there's queen to d8 check. That's the big idea. So takes, check, king takes, king h2. And, all right, materially black is doing fine. I mean, rook and two pawns for two minor pieces. But basically, white's minor pieces should outweigh the black material. One thing you got to be careful about. You don't want to play a quick knight to c3 here with white, because the danger is that, I'm trying to remember exactly the variation. The problem for white is that, if I remember right, the pawn on c2 can become weak, and also the white bishop can have problems. It can be exchanged off in some lines. So from what I recall, I think white wants to play c3 sooner or later, rather than knight to c3. So that's a mini trap in this system. And I think as long as white knows that little mini trap, then white should have the better chances in this ending. Okay, finally, instead of e takes d4 or a6, or knight to d6, which we'll get to in a moment, there's also bishop to e7. And this goes into a kind of inverse capture Berlin. So queen to e2, knight to d6, bishop takes c6, and here, not d takes c6, but b takes c6. And now after d takes e5, knight to b5, the knight's going to come out on c5, but white seems to be a bit better here. This was even played in a world championship, in a Karpov-Korchnoi game back in 1981, and Karpov did a very good job of squeezing him to death and winning. Of course, theory moves on, but that general type of game is what black often has to look forward to. I mean, just less space, and white just is very comfortable here. Okay, so let's get to knight to d6, the main move. All right. Well, bishop takes c6 is the main move, but there's also d takes e5. This is another funny little sideline. Knight takes b5, a4, and the cute point is that the knight is trapped. Now, black has tried in the past, I think, the move d6, and this was an old classic move, and it's not so bad even now. So on a takes b5, black plays knight takes e5. I think, though, maybe white can gain some small initiative with rook to e1. I think queen to e1 has even been played here before, too. This might be interesting. Also, and let's see, from here, after d6, e6 has also been tried, and this was played in some famous old Pillsbury game. I'm not sure if I'll remember exactly what happened. I think Pillsbury took with the pawn. Then it was a takes b5, knight to e7, and then I don't remember if it was b6 here or not, but it was b6 was played very soon. Anyway, this position is kind of interesting, a bit unclear. I mean, black has his extra pawn, but his bishops are not really going to come into the game anytime soon. His king position is a little bit funny. Anyway, it's definitely entertaining, so it can certainly be played. Also, bishop takes e6 can be played here, a b, and then knight e5. Okay, white plays knight to d4, and maybe white has a pull here, or at least an initiative here. Anyway, all of this is academic, though, because black almost always plays knight b to d4 nowadays, just returning the piece. And after knight takes d4, he's got a choice, and actually these lines can transpose. So there's knight takes d4, and there's d5. On knight takes d4, queen d4, then black plays d5. And sometimes you'll see players taking the day off like this. E takes d6, and passant, queen takes d6. And now queen e4 check. Queen e6, queen d4, queen d6, queen e4, queen e6, and so on forever. But white can play queen to e3 check, and maybe this is good for a very small pull. Bishop to e7. Yeah, the difference here is that now if queen to e6, I believe white will play queen to c3. So this is the point. So the queen avoids the back and forth, and now it's supporting rook to e1. And it's also hitting g7 and c7. It hits c7 cleanly, but I mean the point is that if something like bishop to e7, we can also take on g7. So that's why that's not so great. So bishop to e7, knight c3, c6, and now rook to e1 probably gives white a very small pull. Knight to e4 looks natural. I mean, you're getting this move with tempo, but I'm not sure that helps. Queen e6, f4, and here I think a good move, a good novelty for you guys. Castles. Okay, it looks like it would be a bad move because of f5 and then f6. But it turns out after bishop to d8, f takes g7, both rook to e8, the most obvious move, and also bishop to b6 are both acceptable for black. So I think knight e4 is not so dangerous, but rook to e1 again might give white a very, very small pull. So once again, for this reason, well, actually, it's not quite right. I mean, d5 can transpose. So on e takes d6, queen takes, or knight takes d4, queen d6, we're back to what we just looked at before. Black can also try after e takes d6, bishop takes d6. And now rook e1 check, bishop e7. Now knight c6, queen d1, rook d1, bc, bishop f4. Looks like it might be good for white at first glance. Black has this shattered pawn structure on the queen side, and he hasn't castled yet, but after bishop to f5, I think this is equal. I've tried this a few times with white, in blitz anyway, and I certainly don't have the feeling that white has any advantage here. So, I did okay, but it's definitely not a big deal, and I think white has to be careful to make sure that black's bishops don't become very dangerous. Instead of knight takes c6, though, maybe bishop to g5 gives white a very, very tiny pull. After f6, bishop to e3 takes, bishop takes, castles, and then queen to d3. to stop bishop to f5. Again, maybe white has a very, very small edge, but it's really not much. Nothing to write home about, as they say. Finally, I should mention in this sideline with d takes e5 that white can also try knight takes c6, but this seems to be equal. So queen d7 is a good move, giving the possibility of queen to f5, and I think black is just fine here. Okay, so while d takes e5 is a tricky move, I mean, it has some interesting points, it doesn't seem to promise an advantage. So on to bishop takes c6, and now I'll just note that on b takes c6, there's d takes e5, knight b7, and we have something similar to the that kind of reversed Berlin that I mentioned before. In fact, if queen to e2, bishop to e7 would transpose to the position that I mentioned before that arose in the Karpov-Korchnoi game. Okay, finally, d takes c6. D takes c6, d takes e5, and now we're down to our last two sidelines, except for the ones that we mentioned before that we'll come back to next time. There's knight to e4 here instead of knight to f5. Okay, so on this, queen to e2, bishop f5, rook to d1, queen c8, knight to d4, bishop c5, and now with b4, I think white gets a pretty nice advantage. So this is a very strong move here. So the first point is that on bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, the knight is trapped. It can't go to g5 because of the bishop. It can't go to f6 or d6, obviously, and thanks to b4, it can't go to c5 either. So bishop to b6, but now f3, and again, this knight is just it's a hapless little critter. The only hope that black has is to counterattack. Well, let's say queen to d7, bishop to e3. So we block the diagonal and we protect the knight. On the other hand, it gives the knight a chance to hop away. Let's say castles. And the point here is that if f takes e4, there's bishop to g4. And, well, I'll just show you. Okay, if f takes e4, let's give some question marks. Bishop to g4. Okay, if the knight runs, bishop takes d1 is good, and the knight on d4 will then hang afterward. And if knight to f3, then queen takes d1, and that's why castles was perfectly good. But, of course, white doesn't have to do that. He can play a4, threatening a5, which will win a piece. Okay, knight to g5. The knight hops away. Knight c3. Now the rook is adequately protected. Bishop to g6. And now b5. So white hasn't won any material yet, but the black pieces are all very loose, and his king's position is growing imperiled rapidly. C takes b5, and now a good novelty, I think, for you, a5. And I think this is probably just about winning for white. Bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, queen e7, just takes, and knight takes b5, threatening the pawn on a6. Okay, well, what should black do about this? Note that he cannot play queen takes e5. This walks into deep doo-doo. Knight takes a7 check. Okay, if king to d7, then the rook checks, and that's going to win. And on king to b8, then knight to c6 check, forking everything. B takes c6, bishop to a7 check, and then queen takes e5. Thanks for playing. All right, so after knight takes b5, it would appear that a6 is forced. But knight check. Again, if king to b8, this family fork wins the game. Rook to b1 is coming. Bishop to a7 check, followed by bishop to c5 check is also a very nasty threat. Black is lost. Finally, king to d7. And now just the quiet move rook to b1 is very effective. If, for instance, rook to b8 is protected, well, now we'll see the same trick for a third time. Queen to d2 check, king e8, and once again the fork, knight to c6. Okay, so this line with knight to e4 is it's interesting, but it seems to be bad. At least dubious, and maybe just a full-on question mark, because this knight just gets into trouble. Queen e2. Okay, you can play knight to c5, but then white is getting lots of free moves and a very nice initiative. So bishop f5, rook d1, queen c8, knight d4, and then the key move b4. This puts black in big trouble. Okay, so knight to f5. And now we'll mention, well, what happens if white tries to avoid the endgame? So here we have black trying to go for a favorable version of the ending. I should say that queen takes d8, king takes d8. This is much better than the regular Berlin for black, because the bishop's going to come to c5. Both of his bishops get to develop very, very naturally. So this is what black wants. All right, so this would be rather poor for white. Okay, well, on knight f5, you might think, well, gee, if avoiding the endgame was good last time, after knight to e4, I should play queen to e2. Well, gee, why don't I play queen to e2 this time? Well, the problem here is that knight to d4 is very good. The knight doesn't get in trouble this time at all. It's immediately exchanged. And the key point is that on rook to d1, black has this nice little trick, bishop to g4, and now black gets a very, very good version of the Berlin ending. His bishops both get to good squares, and he hasn't forfeited his castling privileges. So black will be able to castle kingside or queenside, if permitted, and not have any difficulties at all. And he doesn't have, and the knight's been exchanged too, so his minor pieces aren't tripping over each other as well. So this position is entirely good for black. It's equal easily. Okay, so that'll do it for this time. Next time we will turn to these two important fifth move sidelines with queen to e2 and rook to e1. So both have their drop of poison, and you need to know these reasonably well if you want to play the Berlin. Okay, until then, so long.